Racist cop attacks black woman in court, unaware she's the new police chief. A storm churned inside the old courthouse's walls that morning, a storm no one could see coming. The corridors were alive with electric tension, whispers echoing through cold marble halls as anticipation rippled among officers, journalists, and onlookers. In one courtroom, a seasoned cop named Martin Gaines wore an air of arrogance, ready to flex his authority yet again. Meanwhile, an unassuming black woman in a crisp navy pantsuit exuded quiet confidence as she made her way to the same courtroom. Neither knew their fates were about to collide in a spectacular crash of justice, bigotry, and long overdue reckoning that would shake the city to its core. The dawn arrived heavy over Chicago, a pale grey light creeping between towering buildings and illuminating a city that never truly slept. Streets bustled with early commuters, cabs rattled by, and coffee shops hummed with the usual morning hustle. A slender young woman in a pressed navy pantsuit stood outside the imposing structure of the George N. Ayton Criminal Courthouse. She glanced up at the building's neoclassical facade, battered by time and burdened by countless stories of injustice and triumph, her face unreadable in the faint sunlight. This woman was Danielle Holloway. She had arrived in Chicago less than a week ago, her appointment as the new chief of police still a well-kept secret among the mayor's inner circle and select city officials. The official announcement was set for the following Monday, but Danielle was eager to get a pulse on her new environment. Though she had come under the radar, she wanted to see how the justice system operated here, away from orchestrated photo ops and press conferences. She desired the unfiltered truth. So she'd chosen this courthouse, one of the busiest in the country, to witness a high-profile hearing related to organized crime, hoping to glean insights into the city's law enforcement culture. Danielle had grown up in a tough neighborhood in New Orleans, her childhood marked by tragedy and perseverance. Her mother, a strict but loving nurse, had taught her to stand tall against any injustice. Her father, a warm, humorous man who worked construction, left her with an unshakable resilience. After he lost his life to a stray bullet in a drive-by shooting, Danielle dedicated herself to stopping the kind of violence that had torn her family apart. She joined the police academy right out of college, channeling all that grief and passion into a decorated, unwavering career. Rising through the ranks, she became known for her cool head under fire and her razor-sharp integrity. It was that reputation that caught the attention of Chicago's mayor. She took a deep breath of the crisp, chilly air and then pushed open the tall, iron-trimmed doors of the courthouse. Inside, the corridors had a particular scent, a mixture of floor polish, old documents, and the tension of too many anxious souls passing through. Lawyers hurried by with bulging briefcases, while families clung to each other in worn wooden benches, waiting for their loved ones' names to be called. Uniformed officers stood at the security checkpoint, ushering people through metal detectors and scanning bags. Danielle stepped into the line with calm composure. When it was her turn at the checkpoint, the officer on duty, a bald, middle-aged man with a bored expression, cast a quick glance at her. She offered him a polite smile. He asked her to place her phone and bag on the tray for X-ray scanning. "Any weapons, ma'am?" the officer asked, his voice stripped of emotion from too many hours at this post. "None," Danielle replied, pulling out her wallet. She showed him her ID, the standard identification she had brought, not her new credentials as chief of police. The announcement hadn't been made, and she wanted it to stay that way for now. The guard nodded, let her through, and handed her belongings back. Danielle collected her things, thanked him softly, and moved on. No one recognized her yet, and that was precisely what she wanted. She followed signs leading to courtroom 4B. This was where a major hearing was set to take place, the notorious King Street Crew, a criminal organization under scrutiny for trafficking firearms and narcotics. Word was that corruption had crept into various parts of the Chicago Police Department during investigations into the King Street Crew, and Danielle was determined to root out dirty cops the moment she officially took her post. Outside courtroom 4B, she found a seat on a narrow wooden bench alongside a cluster of journalists, each wearing lanyards and badges. One of them, a young woman with bright eyes and a quick smile, introduced herself as Janelle Price, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Danielle recognized the newspaper's name instantly. She'd read many of its articles during her briefing on city affairs. "Are you here for the hearing?" Janelle asked, flipping open a small notepad. Danielle nodded. "Yes, just observing." Janelle studied Danielle for a moment, as though trying to place her. The inquisitive stare lingered, but then she shifted back to her notes. Court employees and officers streamed in and out, preparing for the session. Danielle took the opportunity to scan the corridor, noting the presence of several uniformed officers from the 12th District. She observed how they spoke to people in line, how they carried themselves, searching for any sign of prejudice or frustration. The energy was tense but controlled. When the doors finally swung open, people began filing inside. Danielle rose, smoothed her jacket, and entered. The interior was grander than she'd expected. High ceilings with ornate details in the plaster, wooden pews that creaked under weight, and a bench up front where the judge's seat was flanked by the American flag and the flag of the state of Illinois. The judge presiding was the Honorable Margaret Dorsey, a well-respected figure in Cook County, known for her strict but fair approach. Danielle seated herself near the back, blending with the crowd. She wanted to be an unremarkable face. The hush that settled over the room as the bailiff called for order gave her goosebumps. She felt a chill of anticipation, not knowing that the day's real drama wouldn't even involve the King Street Crew hearing. Rather, it would explode into her life unexpectedly, forcing her to confront a virulent strand of racism that simmered below the surface in the department she was about to command. And in that quiet, as she waited for the first case to be called, Danielle sensed she was on the cusp of something monumental. She just had no idea how quickly or violently that something would come hurtling into her life. An hour passed in routine motions and pleas for other cases. Danielle listened intently, gleaning how the local prosecutor handled evidence and how the defense counsel fired back. It was both fascinating and disconcerting to witness the slow grind of justice. She recalled the day she received the call from Mayor Patricia Underwood, telling her that Chicago needed her leadership. The phone call had been brief, but charged with urgency. City Hall was desperate to rebuild trust in the department, especially in marginalized communities. "How soon can you be here?" the mayor had asked. "As soon as you need me," Danielle had replied without hesitation. Now, seated in the back of courtroom 4B, Danielle reflected on the enormity of her new role. She would become one of the youngest police chiefs in the city's history and the first black woman to hold that title. She felt the weight of it. So much needed fixing: relations with the community, accountability among officers, an overhaul of internal policies. Chicago was crying out for reform. Some welcomed her appointment, but she knew others bristled at the idea. She'd been told about pockets of racism and sexism. She was prepared. She just didn't expect it to confront her so directly and so soon. The next case on the docket was the King Street Crew hearing, the main reason she'd come. The bailiff called out the names of the defendants, each accompanied by their respective attorneys. As they shuffled in, shackles jangling, Danielle noticed the uneasy stillness that fell over the crowd. Tension brewed in the air, thick enough to taste. Standing at the prosecution's table was Assistant State's Attorney Leonard Harlow, a tall, lean man in his early 40s with a commanding presence. Opposite him were a cluster of defense attorneys who glared with quiet hostility. Detective John Reese from the Chicago Police Department's Organized Crime Unit was there as well, a grizzled officer known for his unwavering dedication to bringing down gang activity. Judge Dorsey addressed the attorneys, confirming everyone's readiness for the preliminary hearing. Danielle found herself drawn into the arguments, taking mental notes. She admired how Harlow presented the evidence, confident but meticulous, aware that any misstep would be seized upon by the defense. Reese offered testimony about the scale of the gun-running network, describing how illegally purchased firearms from neighboring states made their way into Chicago's south and west sides. The hearing took about an hour. The judge decided there was enough evidence for the case to proceed to trial. As soon as the gavel slammed, people began filing out. The tension spilled into the hallways as defense attorneys barked at reporters to stand back, while prosecutors tried to stay ahead of a flurry of questions from the press. Danielle slipped quietly out into the corridor, letting the sea of bodies sweep past her. She had seen enough for the day. Satisfied that she gleaned a sense of the courthouse dynamic, she decided to leave and get started on a mountain of administrative tasks waiting at her temporary office. She stepped into the corridor, where the crowd was thick, pushing her off to one side. A uniformed officer bumped into her shoulder with a huff, muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch. She frowned but let it go. It was then that she noticed a sudden commotion at the far end of the corridor near the judge's chambers. Raised voices, a scuffle, and the flash of an officer's uniform among a cluster of people. Concerned, Danielle made her way toward the disturbance, weaving through the crowd. What she saw next would set the stage for a life-changing encounter. A white, barrel-chested police officer, his face flushed red with anger, was confronting a defense attorney, then turning to bark at a black female staffer trying to pass by. Something about the scene prickled Danielle's instincts. She paused, reading the situation. It looked like a chaotic trifecta of frustration, a defense attorney possibly cross-examining the officer's approach, a courthouse staffer trying to keep her composure, and the officer letting his temper run rampant. Though she was out of uniform and unrecognized, Danielle was still a law enforcement official. Her sense of responsibility compelled her to step closer. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to come face to face with Sergeant Martin Gaines, a man whose arrogance and prejudice would soon collide with her own unyielding sense of justice. And that collision would send ripples through the entire Chicago Police Department, revealing a racism so insidious it took a woman of unwavering moral courage to bring it to light. Martin Gaines was born and raised on the outskirts of Chicago, in a predominantly white suburb with manicured lawns and an air of privilege. His father, James Gaines, had also been a police officer, though in a smaller district. From a young age, Martin admired the power his father seemed to wield, the gun, the badge, and the respect they commanded. Yet there was a darker side to that admiration. James, shaped by the prejudices of his own father, had carried his own biases into the uniform. Over the dinner table, bigoted remarks were tossed around casually, shaping Martin's worldview. Martin grew up believing he was destined for greatness. Athletic in high school, he excelled in sports and was used to admiration especially from those who looked like him. A certain entitlement sunk into his bones early on, only reinforced when he joined the police academy. He wasn't incompetent, in fact. He was a sharp shooter and physically fit. He sailed through many of the physical exams, but academically and emotionally, he struggled. Critiques that his temperament was ill-suited for de-escalation or that he was too quick to draw conclusions only inflamed his sense of victimhood. In Martin's mind, Any negative feedback came not from his own shortcomings, but from a system that favored everyone else. Once he secured a position in the Chicago Police Department, Martin found a clique of like-minded officers who shared his resentment toward diversity initiatives and evolving departmental policies aimed at building better community relations. For years, Martin operated within a silo of cynicism. Minorities, in his perspective, were either criminals or unworthy of the same respect he offered people in his own circle. He never expressed these beliefs overtly around superiors, but they seeped out in subtle interactions, extra scrutiny at traffic stops for drivers of color, a scoff here, a racial slur uttered under his breath there. Over time, Martin was passed over for promotions, overshadowed by officers who excelled in community engagement and conflict resolution. He stayed stuck at the rank of sergeant for half a decade, growing embittered. The one area he truly thrived in was intimidation and brute force, which occasionally garnered him kudos from certain peers who admired that old-school toughness. Yet official commendations eluded him, fueling his deepening resentments. Recently, Martin had caught wind that the department was about to announce a new chief. Rumors circulated that it would be a black woman from out of state. The notion both enraged and unnerved him. He detested the idea of outside leadership, especially a woman of color, coming in to shake up his department. Though he hadn't yet discovered the new chief's name, the rumor was enough to sour his mood even more. And so, on that particular morning in the courthouse corridor, Sergeant Martin Gaines was already a simmering kettle of frustration and bias. He had been escorting a prisoner to a hearing when a defense attorney, known for civil rights cases, managed to get under Martin's skin with snarky remarks about police corruption. Simultaneously, a young black female staffer politely asked him to move aside so she could pass. Martin's patience snapped, and he lashed out at both the attorney and the staffer, shoving the staffer aside with a callous remark that she should watch where she's going. His fellow officers, seeing the tension, tried to placate him, but Martin was in no mood to calm down. His eyes burned with indignation, and his voice thundered in the marble hallway. People stared, but no one immediately intervened, perhaps out of shock or fear. This was the moment Danielle Holloway stumbled upon, drawn by the commotion from her vantage point outside courtroom 4B. Had Martin known that Danielle was not just an ordinary bystander, but soon to be his commanding officer, perhaps he would have approached the situation differently. But ignorance and anger make for a poisonous blend. And Martin, fueled by both, was about to make a grave mistake, one that would forever change the trajectory of his life and the city's police department. Danielle Holloway moved closer, navigating the restless bystanders gathered around the scene. As she drew near, she saw Sergeant Martin Gaines standing with his arms crossed, his face twisted in anger. The black female staffer appeared shaken, her eyes wide and fearful. Martin's loud voice boomed over the corridor. "I told you, watch where you're going," he snarled. "You want me to write you up for obstruction?" His colleagues nearby looked uneasy. A couple of them recognized the staffer as Rosalind Adams, a quiet, diligent worker in the clerk's office. She had done nothing wrong. In that moment, Danielle's protective instincts flared. She had witnessed countless situations like this in her earlier years, small acts of intimidation and racism that chipped away at a person's dignity. Danielle approached, her voice calm but firm. "Sergeant, is there a problem here?" Martin turned abruptly, eyes narrowing on this woman he didn't recognize. He sized her up, a well-dressed, confident black woman, an unfamiliar face. He assumed she was just another pushy lawyer or maybe a journalist. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. "Back off, police business." Danielle ignored his demand. She placed a gentle hand on Rosalind's shoulder, asking, "Monsieur A.M., are you all right?" Rosalind nodded, still frazzled. "I'm just trying to get to the records room." He shoved me when I tried to pass." Martin let out a derisive snort. "She got in my way, and I was dealing with an aggressive attorney." "Don't make this bigger than it is." A hush fell over the corridor. People had stopped in their tracks to watch this confrontation. Cameras from journalists who'd just covered the King Street crew hearing were turned in their direction. Danielle felt the weight of their stares, but she remained composed. "Sergeant," she repeated, her tone even, "there's no need to shove anyone. This courthouse belongs to the public. If you have an issue, you address it calmly." Martin's face reddened. No one had ever publicly questioned his approach like this, especially not a black woman. Everything in him screamed defiance. "I don't take orders from," but before he could finish, a voice echoed down the hallway. "What's going on here?" Judge Margaret Dorsey, still in her robe, had stepped out to see the commotion herself. Martin stiffened and cleared his throat. He angled himself away from the judge's line of sight, as though to mask his confrontation. Danielle also turned to face the judge. "Just a misunderstanding," Danielle said smoothly, hoping to de-escalate the situation. She didn't want to create a spectacle in the hallway. Judge Dorsey, a seasoned veteran of countless courthouse dramas, scanned the faces before her. She recognized Martin. He had escorted defendants in her court many times, and she also recognized Rosalind, a staffer she trusted. Her stern gaze landed on Martin. "Sergeant, handle yourself properly in my courthouse. If there's a problem, we can discuss it in a more appropriate setting." Martin offered a tight nod, words catching in his throat. The tension in the corridor subsided somewhat, and bystanders began dispersing. Before Judge Dorsey could ask more, she was called back to her chambers. As the crowd thinned, Martin glowered at Danielle. "You're not going to start whining about some kind of police brutality nonsense, are you?" He spat the words with a sarcasm that made Danielle's blood run cold. She realized that engaging him here would only escalate matters. She pulled Rosalind aside, ensuring she was all right, and quietly slipped her a business card with her private cell number. "If you need anything or want to discuss what happened, please call me," she whispered. Rosalind nodded tearfully. Meanwhile, Martin's fellow officers tried to pull him away before he could cause more trouble. One of them, Officer Lucy McAdams, shot Danielle an apologetic glance as they guided him around a corner. Danielle stood there for a moment, heartbeat thudding in her chest. She took a slow, steadying breath. The encounter was over for now, but the memory burned in her mind. She had to remind herself that she still wasn't officially chief. Confronting Martin publicly might cause confusion or undermine the chain of command, but something in her gut told her she'd see Martin again soon, in a more official capacity. Leaving the courthouse, Danielle stepped out into the cool Chicago air. She contemplated the city's complex mix of cultures, the tensions, and the hope. She recalled all the files she'd read about discriminatory practices in certain precincts. She felt a renewed sense of purpose in her bones. Martin Gaines was an embodiment of the type of behavior she was there to root out, prejudice hidden behind a badge, fueled by a sense of impunity. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mayor Underwood's office, confirming a meeting later that afternoon at City Hall to finalize details for Monday's press conference. Danielle responded with a quick affirmative, then hailed a cab. As she rode through the busy streets, the towering skyline passing by, she reflected on how precarious her new position was. Publicly, she was still an unknown, just another face in the crowd. Privately, she was about to become one of the city's most powerful law enforcement officials. The tension between those two identities had never felt sharper. She wondered if Martin would reflect on his actions, or if this was just another day in his world of hostility and intimidation. She feared it was the latter, but she also knew that, come Monday, the scales of power would shift. And when they did, Sergeant Gaines would learn that no one, no matter how entitled they believe themselves to be, is above accountability. The days leading up to Monday's announcement were a quiet whirlwind for Danielle. She spent hours with the mayor's staff, going over policy briefs, department budgets, and strategic goals to curb gun violence. They discussed her plans to strengthen community policing, implement de-escalation training, and foster diversity within the department. Mayor Underwood was candid about the resistance Danielle might face. She mentioned certain veteran officers who clung to old methods of policing like a lifeline. "We need you to be the face of change," Underwood said in her spacious City Hall office. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows, but the pushback will be fierce. Expect it. Danielle nodded, her jaw set with determination. She was used to pushback. She'd faced it all her life, from doubters in New Orleans to fellow cops who resented her rapid promotion. But she also understood the importance of forging alliances. A single chief could only do so much without a supportive command structure. That weekend, Danielle took time to wander Chicago's neighborhoods, wanting to feel the pulse of the city she would soon serve. She strolled through Bronzeville, admired the vibrant murals and bustling shops. She visited a community event in Inglewood, where local activists organized a peace rally. She spoke with mothers who had lost their children to violence, each story reigniting her commitment to transform the city's approach to policing. While Danielle immersed herself in community outreach, Sergeant Martin Gaines brooded. He spent that Saturday evening at a bar near his precinct, nursing a beer and stewing in frustration. He ranted to a few close-knit buddies about the woman who had challenged him at the courthouse. He didn't know her name, but he remembered her face and how she dared to speak to him like he was some common thug. His anger grew as he replayed the scene, each iteration inflaming his ego further. "It's these people," Martin muttered, his voice hushed so only his circle could hear. "They get emboldened by all this talk of reform and accountability, thinking they can walk all over us. I've been on the force for 15 years, you know. I deserve some respect." His friends offered murmurs of agreement or soft grunts, but they mostly let him vent. Even they were a bit uneasy about the way Martin's anger had ratcheted up recently. Some of them had families who didn't share Martin's narrow views, and they worried he'd go too far one day. Still, camaraderie and silence kept their doubts tucked away. They allowed Martin's resentment to fester. That same night, in a quieter corner of the city, Roslyn Adams sat at her kitchen table, the business card Danielle had given her resting between her trembling fingers. She was tempted to call, if only to express her gratitude to the stranger who had stepped in to defend her. But fear held her back. She worried about the repercussions of speaking out against a sergeant. Even though she'd done nothing wrong, she'd seen how quickly things could turn for someone who made a complaint against an officer. In the end, she slipped the card into her purse, silently thankful that someone had shown her a shred of decency in that hallway. The weekend passed like an uneasy calm before a storm. Unknown to most of the city, tectonic shifts in leadership were about to be announced. And for Martin Gaines, it would soon become a day of reckoning he never saw coming. For Danielle Holloway, it would be the day she stepped fully into her destiny and confronted the malignant racism embodied by people like Martin. No one could have predicted just how explosive the unveiling of Chicago's new police chief would be, or how many lives that single event would touch. From City Hall press conferences to precinct locker rooms, the news would reverberate, echoing through streets, communities, and the halls of justice. And in the eye of that storm would stand Danielle Holloway, a woman determined to chart a new course for her department, no matter the cost. Monday morning arrived shrouded in an excited buzz. City Hall was packed with journalists, community leaders, and local politicians. Bright camera lights and news vans clustered outside, capturing the momentous occasion. The air crackled with anticipation as Chicago prepared for the announcement of its new chief of police. Inside a grand chamber, Mayor Underwood took the podium first, scanning the audience with a measured gaze. She was an imposing figure herself, tall, confident, and outspoken about social justice. Adjusting the microphone, she began her speech. Good morning, Chicago. We stand at a pivotal moment in our city's history. Over the past few years, we have faced challenges that have tested our resolve and our faith in one another. But today, we embark on a new chapter, one defined by accountability, transparency, and community partnership. She went on, outlining the accomplishments the city had made and the hardships it had endured. Everyone listened attentively, especially the members of the police force who had been invited. Somewhere near the back of the crowd stood Sergeant Martin Gaines, shifting uncomfortably in his uniform. His expression was a mask of irritation mixed with curiosity. He wanted to see who this new chief was, this rumored woman from out of town. Finally, Mayor Underwood spoke the words that silenced the chamber. It is my honor to introduce you to Chicago's new chief of police, Danielle Holloway. Polite applause rippled through the audience. Martin strained his neck to get a glimpse of this Danielle Holloway, but when he saw the poised black woman stepping up to the podium, he nearly choked. A surge of recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. It was the same woman he had berated in the courthouse corridor, the one who had dared talk back to him. Shock congealed into anger as Martin watched Danielle address the microphone. She was dressed in a crisp navy suit, her hair pinned back in a neat bun, exuding an air of steady confidence. The cameras flashed, capturing her every move. Thank you, Mayor Underwood, and thank you to the people of Chicago for placing your trust in me. Danielle began. I come from a background not unlike many of our neighborhoods, where violence robs us of our loved ones, and where trust in law enforcement has been stretched thin. My mission is to rebuild that trust and reshape our department into one that truly serves and protects all communities, without prejudice and without corruption. Her voice echoed through the chamber. Martin felt his face grow hot. He recalled that humiliating moment in the hallway. She had told him how to do his job. The memory burned. As Danielle concluded her speech, pledging to hold everyone in the department accountable, Martin clenched his fists. He glanced around, worried others might notice his expression. But no one did. Everyone was fixated on the new chief. After the press conference, people flocked to congratulate Danielle, shaking her hand, offering warm welcomes, or pitching ideas for reform. Some of the top brass in the department introduced themselves, their eyes betraying curiosity or skepticism. Danielle greeted them cordially, aware that she had to build alliances carefully. For a moment, Martin considered slipping out discreetly before Danielle saw him, but fate had other plans. In the swirl of cameras and handshakes, Danielle spotted Martin standing by the exit. Their eyes locked. For a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of panic in his gaze. Then it was replaced by a forced neutrality. She excused herself from a conversation and made her way over. Sergeant Gaines, correct? She said, extending her hand. Danielle Holloway, pleased to meet you again under more formal circumstances this time. Martin hesitated, then gripped her hand with a perfunctory shake. If not for the cameras around, he might have refused altogether. Chief, he managed to say. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. They stood there, the tension palpable. Danielle maintained a polite smile, though inside she wondered how best to approach this man. She knew he recognized her. She had not expected to cross paths so soon again, but she also felt a quiet resolve. Martin's presence in her department represented a pocket of resistance. She couldn't ignore. This was the moment they both understood the stakes. One of them would prevail, and the other would have to adapt or face consequences. I look forward to working with you, Danielle said, her tone measured. I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss the direction of the department." Martin swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am," he replied through gritted teeth. Then, his voice dropping, he added, "Chief, I hope you realize we run things a certain way here." "Change doesn't happen overnight." Danielle raised an eyebrow, catching the implied challenge in his words. She kept her composure. "Understood. But change is coming, Sergeant. Rest assured." With that, she turned to greet another cluster of officials. Martin stood there momentarily, anger simmering beneath his veneer. He could sense that everything familiar was about to be upended. By the time he left City Hall, his mind raced with ways to maintain his status quo and ensure that this newcomer didn't dismantle everything he considered his birthright. Danielle's first official day as Chicago's chief of police was an exercise in controlled chaos. Media outlets clamored for interviews, while community organizations flooded her office with letters, phone calls, and social media messages expressing both hope and doubt. The main police headquarters buzzed with an energy Danielle found invigorating, if a bit overwhelming. She spent the early morning touring various divisions, accompanied by Deputy Chief Florence Reyes, a no-nonsense officer of Puerto Rican descent who had worked in the department for over 20 years. Reyes offered honest assessments of each unit, pointing out strong suits as well as areas in dire need of reform. They visited the training facility, the operations room, and the K-9 unit. Everywhere they went, officers snapped to attention. Some greeted Danielle respectfully, while others wore expressions of guarded skepticism. She remained cordial but focused, absorbing everything she saw and heard like a sponge. By midday, she met with the command staff in the sprawling conference room overlooking a busy downtown street. Danielle took a seat at the head of the polished oak table. Immediately, she noticed Sergeant Martin Gaines among the attendees, his uniform starched and his posture rigid. She wasn't entirely surprised to see him, though a sergeant. Martin had a knack for inserting himself into important meetings, forging alliances with certain older brass who admired a tough cop approach. "Good afternoon, everyone," Danielle began. "Thank you for joining me. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss an initial plan for departmental reforms. I'd like to walk through some key objectives and hear your thoughts, concerns, or any ideas on how to streamline this process." She passed out handouts detailing areas of focus, community engagement initiatives, enhanced bias training, greater oversight of use of force incidents, and stricter accountability measures for misconduct. Many in the room scanned the documents with interest. Colonel David O'Neill, a tall man with silver hair, shifted in his seat. "Chief, we all understand the need for accountability, but do you worry about morale taking a hit? Some officers might feel that they're under a microscope, being second-guessed by civilians who don't understand the dangers of this job." Danielle nodded. "I understand that concern. But transparency and accountability are essential for trust. Without trust, we can't effectively do our jobs. This isn't about punishing good officers. It's about ensuring that everyone operates with integrity. The community's trust is paramount, and we build that by showing we have nothing to hide." A few people murmured agreement. Colonel O'Neill seemed placated, but not fully convinced. Then Martin spoke up, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "Chief, I appreciate the sentiment, but let's be honest about what we face out there: violent criminals, gangs, and suspects who don't hesitate to pull a trigger on an officer. Sometimes those situations require swift, decisive action. We can't be pausing to check a rulebook in the middle of a gunfight, or worry about being labeled racist every time we stop someone who happens to be a minority." A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Danielle, waiting for her response. She looked at Martin carefully. She recognized his words for what they were, an attempt to undermine her approach, couched in the language of practicality. "I don't think anyone here is suggesting we handcuff ourselves when facing an armed suspect." Danielle replied, maintaining her calm. But we do need to ensure we're not falling back on biases, conscious or unconscious, when deciding who to stop, how we approach them, and what level of force we use. Our training will include better de-escalation tactics and implicit bias awareness, so that each situation is approached with the precision it deserves. Martin's lips thinned, and if officers disagree with the approach, Danielle's gaze was steady. Then we'll have to talk about whether those officers belong in a department that's determined to serve every member of the community fairly. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Some officers exchanged glances. Martin's face hardened. He opened his mouth to retort, but Colonel O'Neill cut him off, clearing his throat. "All right, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We have a plan, and we have concerns. Let's keep the dialogue productive." The meeting wrapped up after another hour of back and forth. As the command staff dispersed, Danielle noticed Martin lingering. She met his gaze. There was a storm brewing behind his eyes, a challenge she knew wouldn't simply dissipate. He gave her a curt nod before leaving. Deputy Chief Reyes sidled up to Danielle once they were alone. "He's trouble," she said quietly, glancing at the door. Martin had just walked through. "I've heard complaints for years. Racial profiling, aggressive force, intimidation. But none of it ever stuck. He knows how to navigate the system, and he's got a network of old-timers who back him up." Danielle nodded. "Thank you for the heads up. I figured as much." Reyes offered a thin smile. "We've been waiting for someone like you to finally hold these guys accountable." Danielle sighed. "I just hope I can live up to everyone's expectations." She left the conference room with a renewed sense of purpose. The city's trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, and she had to be strategic in her approach. But she also understood that accountability started within the department, rooting out the toxic attitudes that undermined everything good policing stood for. She didn't know how soon the confrontation would come, but she could feel the tension in the air. Martin Gaines was on a collision course with her principles, and the outcome would define the tone of her entire tenure as chief of police. A week later, Danielle's reforms were slowly taking shape. Trainings were scheduled, committees formed, and new protocols drafted. Yet the tension with Martin simmered. She heard rumors that he dismissed her efforts as bureaucratic nonsense, and kept stoking fear among rank-and-file officers that they'd be left defenseless against criminals. One crisp morning, Danielle received an unexpected subpoena at her office. She was called to testify in a hearing regarding a police misconduct lawsuit. A young black man, Terrence Lawson, alleged he was falsely arrested and roughed up by officers, including Martin Gaines, during a traffic stop the previous year. The case had picked up steam recently, thanks to newly surfaced dashcam footage that contradicted the officers' statements. Danielle was asked to provide insight into departmental policies, especially use of force guidelines. The courthouse corridors felt eerily familiar as she arrived for the hearing. Journalists darted back and forth, sniffing for headlines. Some recognized Danielle, snapping photos as she entered the courtroom. Inside, she found her seat behind the prosecutor's table. The defense side was already occupied by Martin and 3 other officers named in the lawsuit, along with their union-appointed attorney. Martin avoided Danielle's eyes, but she could sense his hostility. His posture was rigid, face set in a grim mask. The hearing began with procedural formalities before the plaintiff's attorney, Naomi Carter, launched into a methodical presentation of the evidence. She played snippets of the dashcam footage showing Martin and the other officers yanking Terrence out of his car, slamming him against the hood and cuffing him while Terrence shouted he was complying. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The footage then showed Martin claiming Terrence had resisted and reached for a weapon. However, no weapon was visible, and Terrence had no criminal record. Danielle's stomach tightened as she watched. This was precisely the sort of policing culture she aimed to eradicate. Naomi called Danielle to the stand. Sworn in, Danielle answered questions about the department's official policies on traffic stops and use of force. Our policy requires officers to use the minimum force necessary and only escalate if the suspect poses a genuine threat, Danielle explained, voice resonating clearly through the quiet courtroom. Based on the footage, it appears Terence Lawson was cooperative, and there's no evidence of him posing an immediate threat. The defense attorney, a stout man named Leonard Crowley, rose. Chief Holloway, you're new to the position, is that correct? Yes, I started officially 2 weeks ago. And you weren't present during this incident last year, so your assessment is purely theoretical, based on policy, correct? Danielle met his gaze evenly. My assessment is based on departmental policy, and the evidence presented, yes. Crowley pressed, is it possible that the dashcam footage doesn't show everything? That the officers perceived a threat you're not seeing? Anything is possible, but I haven't seen any indication of a threat. The audio doesn't record Mr. Lawson making threats or resisting. In fact, he appears compliant. A flicker of annoyance crossed Crowley's face. So you're prepared to throw your own officers under the bus, less than a month into your tenure? Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm prepared to uphold the standards this department claims to stand for. If an officer violates those standards, it's not throwing them under the buses to say so, it's holding them accountable. A quiet murmur rolled through the courtroom. Martin's jaw tightened. He stared daggers at Danielle from the defense table. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, then turned back to the prosecutor's table, hearing the judge instruct the attorneys to wrap up. As the hearing recessed for lunch, Martin cornered Danielle near the exit, stepping into her path. You really think you can waltz in here and side with scumbags who lie about police brutality? He hissed under his breath. Danielle bristled. People watched, uncertain if they should intervene. Sergeant, watch your tone. Or what? You'll have me fired? Martin sneered. This is exactly what I meant. You want to gut the force, tie our hands, and let criminals run amok. Let me tell you something, Chief. You might have the mayor's favor now, but officers like me, real cops, are the ones who keep the city from burning. You have no idea what it's like on these streets. A half-dozen reporters hovered nearby, eager for a soundbite. Danielle inhaled slowly, trying to stay composed. You are out of line, Sergeant. I suggest you step back and calm yourself before you say anything else you'll regret. He threw up his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. Fine, but this isn't over. With that, Martin stormed off, leaving Danielle standing among the hushed crowd. She sensed the gravity of the moment. Martin's public challenge was like a shot, fired in the open one that wouldn't easily be forgotten. The cameras had caught every word, and by evening, snippets of the confrontation would flood the local news cycle. It was a personal challenge, yes, but also a litmus test for Danielle's leadership. How she responded to Martin's open defiance would set the tone for her entire agenda. Danielle made her way out of the courthouse, ignoring the barrage of reporters' questions about tension in the ranks. Her phone buzzed with calls from City Hall, likely concerned about the media fallout. Yet beneath the stress, Danielle felt a grim determination take root. She had to stand her ground, not just for her own sake, but for every honest officer who believed in real change and for every citizen who deserved it. The fallout from Martin's courthouse outburst was immediate. Local news outlets ran headlines, "Rift in CPD," new chief confronted by veteran officer. Opinion pieces questioned Danielle's authority. Community leaders applauded her stance against police misconduct, while police union representatives demanded she respect the men and women on the front lines. Within the department, sides formed quickly. Younger officers, especially those from diverse backgrounds, admired Danielle's commitment to accountability. Others echoed Martin's complaints that the new chief was undermining them. The tension was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came 3 days after the hearing. An urgent call crackled through dispatch. Shots fired in an abandoned warehouse on the south side. A SWAT team was deployed, and Martin, who was on duty nearby, took it upon himself to respond. The suspect was rumored to be a member of the King Street crew, armed and dangerous. By the time Danielle received word, Martin and his small unit had already stormed the warehouse. She rushed to the scene, lights flashing on her unmarked SUV. Outside, officers formed a perimeter behind their vehicles. Gunshots echoed from inside the building. Deputy Chief Reyes updated Danielle, her voice taut with worry. They went in without waiting for backup. The suspect might have hostages. We're trying to get a team in place to negotiate, but Martin insisted they go in guns blazing. A sour dread gnawed at Danielle. She grabbed a ballistic vest from the trunk, slid it on, and headed toward the command post. A swarm of SWAT officers readied themselves, rifles cradled in tense grips. Danielle conferred quickly with the SWAT commander, urging him to deploy a crisis negotiator. But Martin and his men were already deep inside, ignoring standard protocol. Inside the darkened warehouse, Martin led his team through a maze of crates and metal scaffolding. The suspect fired wild shots, forcing them to take cover. Adrenaline pumped through Martin's veins. He was determined to prove he was the kind of cop who didn't hesitate. He'd show everyone, especially that uppity new chief, that real policing required guts, not woke guidelines. Then came a horrifying realization. A teenage boy was crouched behind crates, terrified, hands up. Martin saw only a shadowy figure and pulled the trigger. A single shot echoed through the cavernous space. The boy screamed, collapsing to the floor. Blood pooled around him. One of Martin's fellow officers, pale-faced, shouted, "My God, Martin! That's just a kid!" A wave of shock froze Martin. The boy was unarmed, clearly not the suspect. I didn't know," he stammered, staring at the trembling child. Regret and fear warred in his eyes. Moments later, the real suspect emerged from behind a corner, returning fire. Another officer radioed for backup. SWAT poured in, quickly subduing the shooter. Medics rushed to the boy, who was fading fast. Martin stood paralyzed, weapon still clutched in his trembling hands. Outside, Danielle heard the chaotic radio chatter. "We have a civilian down, possible friendly fire." She ran in with the medics, heart pounding. The scene was grim. She saw the wounded teenager and Martin's shell, shocked expression. Horror ripped through her. If they couldn't save the boy, Martin's carelessness would go down as yet another tragedy, an unarmed black youth shot by a police officer. Paramedics worked frantically, stabilizing the boy's vitals. The child was alive, but barely. They whisked him away in an ambulance. Danielle watched them leave, swallowing a lump in her throat. Then she turned to Martin, who stood under flickering overhead lights, face ashen. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice thick with anger and sorrow. Martin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The weight of his actions hung in the stale air. Officers surrounded them, some filming on their phones. The deputy chief arrived, her expression torn between fury and heartbreak. Danielle stepped forward, her voice now steely with resolve. "Sergeant Martin Gaines, you are hereby relieved of duty. Hand over your weapon and badge. Now." He stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. His hands shook as he surrendered his gun. No one moved to defend him. Even the officers who once admired his bravado couldn't condone what he'd done. When Martin finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I didn't mean it, Chief." Danielle locked eyes with him, tears burning at the corners of her vision. "But you did it," she replied coldly, "and you will face the consequences." Under the dim lights of that decrepit warehouse, Martin's career and his aura of invincibility shattered. And for Danielle, The line had been crossed. There would be no more half measures, no more tolerance for prejudice or recklessness. The path forward would be paved by justice, no matter how painful. In the days that followed, the story consumed Chicago. News outlets played the tragic warehouse shooting on a loop. The teenage boy's condition was critical. He was on life support at Chicago Memorial. Vigils formed outside the hospital, crowds praying for his recovery. Protesters marched in front of police headquarters, demanding accountability and an end to trigger happy policing. The department moved swiftly. Danielle placed Martin on immediate suspension and recommended his termination. Simultaneously, an independent investigation was launched by the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. Her decision ignited fierce debate, with the police union claiming excessive punishment and activists asserting it was merely the first step of many required to dismantle systemic racism. Meanwhile, Martin sat alone in his modest apartment. The department had collected his badge and service weapon. His phone buzzed with calls from union reps and a handful of supporters, but he felt emptier than ever. Public condemnation was brutal, his face plastered on newspapers, and TV labeled the cop who shot an unarmed teen. A heavy air of disgrace weighed on him. Fear clawed at his insides too. He might face criminal charges. For Martin, it was a reckoning. The bravado that once fueled him was gone, replaced by gnawing regret and shame. His entire life had revolved around wearing that badge and lauding authority over others. Now, with a single gunshot, he had lost that identity and possibly ended a young life. Karma, it seemed, had come in the form of a horrifying mistake. Across town, Danielle visited the hospital. She met the boy's mother, an exhausted woman who clutched her son's hand in silent grief. Danielle offered condolences and vowed to do everything in her power to hold the responsible officer accountable. The mother said nothing at first, tears streaming down her cheeks. But as Danielle turned to go, she whispered, "Please, make sure this never happens again." The words echoed in Danielle's mind, fueling her determination. Back at headquarters, she convened an emergency meeting with the command staff. She demanded immediate reforms to the pursuit policy, mandatory body cam use for all responding officers, and more rigorous vetting for high-stress operations. She announced a new community liaison board, inviting local residents to participate in shaping policing strategies. Some of the old guard resisted, complaining it was too radical, but Danielle stood firm. The city couldn't afford more tragedies. A week after the shooting, news arrived. The teenage boy was stabilizing, showing signs of recovery. Doctors called it a miracle. Danielle felt a surge of relief upon hearing it. Though the path to healing was long, at least the boy had a chance at life. She sent flowers to his hospital room, along with a note, "I'm praying for your full recovery and working to ensure no one else endures what you have." Meanwhile, Martin's hearing before the disciplinary board approached. Community members demanded he face criminal charges, and the state's attorney's office was reviewing the case. Martin walked into the hearing room alone, ignoring stares and whispered remarks. Danielle watched from her seat at the board's table. She felt a mixture of anger at his recklessness and a strange pity for the fallen officer whose life was unraveling. The board deliberated only briefly. The conclusion was unanimous. Martin was fired, effective immediately, and the case was referred to the district attorney for potential prosecution. Martin looked hollowed out as the verdict was read. He avoided Danielle's eyes, staring at the floor in silent resignation. Outside, reporters swarmed him with questions. He trudged away without a word. Days later, an indictment was handed down. Martin would stand trial for aggravated battery and reckless discharge of a firearm. Mayor Underwood publicly commended the move. Danielle privately hoped it would bring some measure of justice and closure, though she knew the legal process could be long and complicated. Throughout all of this, Danielle continued her work, forging alliances with community groups, empowering honest officers, and methodically rooting out those who refused to uphold the department's standards. The reforms were not instantaneous, nor were they universally beloved, but every step forward brought a surge of hope to people who had long been wary of the badge. In the end, Martin's downfall was a microcosm of a larger transformation. The era of unchecked power and bigotry behind a shield was ending, replaced by a new vision, one that demanded integrity from those sworn to protect and serve. And while karma had struck Martin hard, it had also ignited a spark of possibility across Chicago. The city glimpsed a future in which law enforcement stood not as a force of intimidation, but as a guardian of justice for all. And so, under the fierce leadership of Chief Danielle Holloway, the Chicago Police Department found itself on a path of profound change. The hard fall of Sergeant Martin Gaines became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no badge could protect those who breached their sacred oath. Change did not happen overnight, but step by step, the city began to heal. If you found this story moving, inspiring, or enlightening, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shine a light on truth and justice. Your support helps these important conversations reach more people. Together, we can continue to champion accountability, fight against racial prejudice, and push for reforms that uplift our communities. Thank you for watching, and never doubt the power of steadfast leadership, compassion, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.